The military base buzzed with its usual evening activity as soldiers moved between buildings, their boots echoing against concrete floors. Captain Sarah Mitchell walked through the dimly lit corridor of Building C, her civilian clothes masking her true identity. She had deliberately chosen to dress down for this unannounced inspection, wanting to observe how her personnel behaved when they thought no high-ranking officers were watching. At 34, Sarah had climbed the ranks faster than most, earning her stars through exceptional leadership during 3 combat deployments. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore jeans and a plain sweater that made her look like any other visitor to the base. The only hint of her military background was her confident stride and the way her eyes constantly scanned her surroundings. Private Jake Morrison was having the worst day of his military career. The 22-year-old had received a harsh reprimand from his sergeant that morning, failed his weapons inspection, and discovered his girlfriend back home had been cheating on him with his best friend. The letter from her sat crumpled in his pocket, each word burning in his memory like acid. Jake had enlisted 3 years ago, hoping to make something of himself after growing up in foster care. The military had given him purpose, structure, and a family he never had. But lately everything seemed to be falling apart. His performance was slipping, his confidence was shattered, and he felt like he was drowning in a sea of regulations and expectations he couldn't meet. As Sarah rounded the corner near the supply depot, she noticed the storage room door was slightly ajar. This violated several security protocols, and she made a mental note to address this during tomorrow's briefing. She approached the door quietly, intending to secure it properly and document the violation. Jake had been walking in the opposite direction, his head down and his mind racing with angry thoughts about his girlfriend's betrayal. He wasn't paying attention to his surroundings, which was another violation of basic military awareness training. His emotions were clouding his judgment, and all he could think about was how everyone in his life seemed to disappoint him. The collision happened in an instant. Jake rounded the corner at the same moment Sarah reached for the storage room door. His shoulder caught her arm, sending her stumbling backward toward the wall. In his frustrated state, Jake's reflexes kicked in aggressively rather than apologetically. "Watch where you're going," he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty corridor. Without thinking, his training took over, but not the right kind of training. Instead of the discipline and respect drilled into every soldier, his raw emotions and bad day erupted into something unprofessional and dangerous. Jake's hands moved before his brain could stop them. He grabbed Sarah by the shoulders and pushed her firmly against the concrete wall, pinning her there. His face was inches from hers, his breathing heavy with frustration and anger that had been building all day. "You people need to learn some respect around here," he said through gritted teeth, his voice low and threatening. "This is a military installation, not some playground where you can just wander around without watching where you're going." Sarah's initial shock quickly transformed into something else entirely. She had been in combat situations, faced enemy fire, and commanded respect from soldiers twice her size and age. Being manhandled by one of her own personnel on her own base was both infuriating and unacceptable. But she also recognized something in Jake's eyes that gave her pause. This wasn't just aggression or disrespect. This was a young soldier who was clearly struggling with something much deeper than a simple collision in a hallway. His grip on her shoulders was firm but not violent, and beneath his anger, she could see pain and desperation. "Soldier," she said calmly, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. "I think you need to take a step back and reconsider what you're doing right now." Jake's mind was still clouded with emotion, and he didn't immediately process the tone of command in her voice. He saw only a civilian who had gotten in his way on the worst day of his life. Someone he could take his frustrations out on without consequence. "Don't tell me what I need to do, lady," he replied, pressing her shoulders more firmly against the wall. "You have no idea what kind of day I've had, and you definitely have no business telling a soldier how to handle situations on his own base." The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows on the walls around them. The corridor was empty except for the two of them, and the sound of distant conversations and radio chatter seemed to fade away as the confrontation intensified. Sarah studied Jake's face carefully, noting the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his jaw was clenched with frustration, and the slight tremor in his hands that suggested he was operating on pure adrenaline rather than clear thinking. She had seen this look before in soldiers who were pushed to their breaking point, and she knew this situation required careful handling. "What's your name, soldier?" she asked, her voice remaining steady despite being pinned against the wall. "Private Morrison," he answered automatically, his military training responding even though his conscious mind was still focused on his anger. "And you still haven't told me what business you have wandering around restricted areas of this base?" Sarah felt a small smile tug at the corner of her mouth, though she kept her expression neutral. Private Morrison was about to learn a lesson he would never forget, but not in the way he expected. She decided to let this play out just a little longer to see how far his insubordination would go, and to better understand what was driving this young soldier to such desperate behavior. The next few seconds would change both of their lives forever, though neither of them knew it yet. The tension in the corridor grew thicker as Jake maintained his grip on Sarah's shoulders. His breathing was still heavy, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the building. The anger that had been simmering all day was finally boiling over, and he felt a strange sense of power in this moment of confrontation. "You know what your problem is?" Jake continued, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "People like you think you can just walk onto a military base and do whatever you want. You probably don't even understand what we sacrifice every day to serve this country." Sarah remained perfectly calm, which only seemed to fuel Jake's frustration further. She had dealt with hundreds of soldiers over her career, and she knew that sometimes the best way to handle an emotional outburst was to let it run its course while maintaining control of the situation. "I understand more than you might think," she replied quietly, her eyes never leaving his face. "But right now, I'm more concerned about understanding what's driving you to act this way. This isn't normal behavior for a soldier, even one who's having a bad day." Jake's grip tightened slightly, and for a moment Sarah wondered if she had misjudged the situation. But then she saw something flicker in his eyes, a moment of uncertainty as if he was suddenly realizing what he was doing. "Don't pretend to care about me," he said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "You don't even know me. You're just another civilian who thinks they can psychoanalyze soldiers like we're some kind of science experiment." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Sarah. Here was one of her own soldiers, calling her a civilian while simultaneously assaulting her in a military facility. Under normal circumstances, Jake's career would be over before the sun set. But something about his desperation made her want to understand what had brought him to this point. "You're right, I don't know you," she acknowledged. "But I know soldiers, and I know that good people sometimes do things they regret when they're pushed too far. What happened today that made you feel like you had no other choice but to take it out on a stranger?" Jake's eyes widened slightly at her question. He hadn't expected compassion or genuine concern. In his experience, confrontations like this ended with security being called and paperwork being filed. The fact that this woman seemed genuinely interested in his well-being caught him completely off guard. "It's nothing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Just personal stuff. Nothing that concerns you." "Try me," Sarah said gently. "Sometimes talking to a stranger is easier than talking to people who know you. And right now we're both stuck in this situation until you decide what you want to do next." For the first time since the confrontation began, Jake really looked at the woman he had pinned against the wall. She was probably in her 30s, with intelligent green eyes and a calm demeanor that seemed unshakable even under pressure. There was something about her that reminded him of his favorite high school teacher, the only adult who had ever really believed in him. "My girlfriend," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 years together, and she's been cheating on me with my best friend from back home. Found out today in a letter. She didn't even have the guts to tell me over the phone." Sarah felt her heart soften slightly. Military relationships were notoriously difficult, and she had seen too many good soldiers destroyed by personal problems they couldn't control. The isolation, the long deployments, the constant stress of military life, it all took a toll on even the strongest relationships. "That's devastating," she said sincerely. 3 years is a long time to invest in someone, and finding out that way must have felt like a betrayal of everything you thought you knew about her. Jake nodded, and Sarah noticed his grip on her shoulders had loosened considerably. He was still keeping her against the wall, but the aggressive pressure was gone, replaced by something that felt more like he was holding on to her for emotional support. "She was supposed to be waiting for me," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "We had plans. I was going to propose when I got home on leave next month. Had the ring and everything. And your friend?" Sarah asked carefully, sensing that there was more to this story. Marcus, Jake said with a bitter laugh. We grew up together in the same foster home. He was like a brother to me. The only family I had before I joined the military. Now I've lost both of them and I don't even know what I did wrong. Sarah could see the complete defeat in Jake's eyes now. This wasn't just about anger or aggression. This was about a young man who felt like his entire world had collapsed in a single day. She had seen this before in soldiers who were pushed beyond their emotional limits, and she knew that without proper support it could lead to much more serious problems. Jake, she said, using his first name deliberately to create a more personal connection. What you're feeling right now is completely understandable, but taking it out on innocent people isn't going to make the pain go away. If anything, it's going to create new problems for you that will make everything worse. Jake looked at her with surprise. He realized she had remembered his name from when he introduced himself, and there was something about the way she said it that felt different from how his superiors usually addressed him. It wasn't condescending or dismissive. It was almost maternal. You don't understand, he said, but his voice lacked the anger it had carried moments before. I don't have anyone else. The military was supposed to be my new family, but I'm failing at everything here too. My sergeant thinks I'm worthless, I can't pass my inspections, and now I'm probably going to get court-martialed for assaulting a civilian on base. Sarah saw an opportunity to de-escalate the situation, while also teaching Jake an important lesson. She could reveal her identity now and watch him crumble under the weight of his mistake, or she could continue to play the role of concerned civilian and see if she could actually help him work through his problems. What makes you think you're failing? She asked instead. From what I can see, you're a soldier who cares deeply about doing the right thing even if you're struggling right now. People who don't care don't get this upset when things go wrong. Jake stared at her in amazement. No one had said anything positive about his military service in months. Every interaction with his superiors seemed to focus on his mistakes and shortcomings, and he had begun to believe that maybe he just wasn't cut out for military life. You really think that? He asked, his grip on her shoulders now completely relaxed. I do, Sarah said firmly. But I also think you need to let go of me now and start figuring out how to move forward from this moment. Because what happens next is going to determine whether this is the worst day of your military career, or the day you started turning things around. Jake slowly released his grip on Sarah's shoulders and took a step back, his hands falling to his sides. The reality of what he had done was starting to sink in, and he felt a wave of shame wash over him that was almost as overwhelming as his earlier anger had been. I'm sorry, he said quietly, unable to meet her eyes. I don't know what came over me. This isn't who I am, I swear. I've never put my hands on someone like that before. Sarah straightened her sweater and rolled her shoulders, working out the tension from being pressed against the wall. She could see that Jake was genuine in his remorse, and his behavior now was completely different from the aggressive young man who had cornered her just minutes earlier. I believe you, she said, her voice gentle but firm, but you need to understand that having a bad day isn't an excuse for what just happened. If I had been someone else, someone who felt threatened enough to call security or press charges, your military career would be over right now. Jake nodded miserably, finally understanding the full scope of his mistake. You're going to report this, aren't you? I mean, you should. I deserve whatever punishment comes from this. Sarah studied his face carefully, seeing genuine remorse and fear rather than the defiance she might have expected. This was a teaching moment that could either destroy a young soldier or potentially save his career, depending on how she handled it. That depends on you, she said. What are you going to do to make sure something like this never happens again? Jake looked at her with confusion. I don't understand. You're giving me a choice? I'm giving you an opportunity to show me who you really are, Sarah replied. The angry, desperate young man who grabbed me, or the soldier who signed up to serve his country and protect people. Right now, I need to see the soldier. For the first time since their encounter began, Jake stood up straighter, his military training automatically correcting his posture. Something about her words triggered a response that went deeper than his emotional turmoil. Ma'am, I want to be the soldier, he said, his voice stronger than it had been all day. I know I screwed up badly, but I enlisted because I wanted to be part of something bigger than myself. I wanted to make a difference and serve with honor. Today I forgot all of that. Sarah felt a spark of hope. Underneath all the personal pain and frustration, Jake still had the core values that made a good soldier. He just needed guidance and support to remember how to access them when life got difficult. "Tell me about your first day in the military," she said, leaning against the wall in a more relaxed posture. "What made you decide to enlist?" Jake's face brightened slightly as he remembered. "I was aging out of foster care and had nowhere to go. No family, no real job prospects, and I was getting into trouble. But I met this recruiter at a job fair who told me the military could give me structure, purpose, and a chance to serve something bigger than my own problems." "And how did that feel?" Sarah asked. "That first day of basic training?" "Terrifying," Jake admitted with a small smile. "But also exciting. Like I was finally somewhere I belonged. The drill sergeants were hard on us, but it was fair. If you worked hard and followed the rules, you got respect. It was the first time in my life that felt true." Sarah could see the young man Jake had been when he first enlisted. Hopeful, determined, and eager to prove himself. That person was still there, buried under layers of recent disappointment and self-doubt. "What would that recruit think of the soldier you became today?" she asked gently. "Not just in this hallway, but in the weeks and months leading up to today. When did you stop being the person who was excited to serve?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, really thinking about her question. "I think it started about 6 months ago," he said finally. "I made some mistakes during a training exercise and my sergeant started treating me like I was hopeless. Then my performance reviews got worse and I started believing maybe I wasn't cut out for this after all. And instead of asking for help or working harder to improve, you started giving up," Sarah observed. "The problems with your girlfriend probably made it worse because you felt like you were failing at everything in your life." Jake nodded, feeling exposed but also relieved to finally talk to someone about what had been eating away at him. "Exactly. It felt like no matter what I did, I couldn't get anything right. So I stopped trying as hard, which made everything worse." Sarah recognized this pattern from many soldiers she had mentored over the years. Young recruits who started strong but lost their way when they hit their first real challenges. The difference between soldiers who thrived and those who washed out often came down to whether they had someone who believed in them during the difficult times. "Jake, I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you," she said. "Every good soldier goes through what you're experiencing right now. The questioning, the self-doubt, the feeling like you're not measuring up. It's part of growing into the person the military needs you to become." Jake looked at her skeptically. "Even the really successful soldiers? The ones who get promoted and lead other people?" "Especially them," Sarah said with conviction. "The soldiers who never struggle, who never doubt themselves, who never face adversity, they're the ones you need to worry about. Because when they finally do hit a real challenge, they don't know how to handle it. But soldiers who work through these difficult periods, they come out stronger and more resilient than they ever imagined possible." For the first time all day, Jake felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe his recent struggles weren't a sign that he was meant to fail. Maybe they were just part of the process of becoming the soldier he was meant to be. "So what do I do now?" he asked. "And how do I turn this around?" Sarah smiled, seeing the determination starting to return to his eyes. "First, you're going to help me secure that storage room that's been left open, because that's a security violation that needs to be addressed immediately. Then you're going to walk me to the base commander's office." Jake's face went pale. "You're going to report me after all?" "No," Sarah said, her smile growing wider. "I'm going to introduce you to someone who can help you get your career back on track. But first, I think there's something you should know about who you've been talking to for the past 10 minutes. Jake felt his stomach drop. There was something in her tone that suggested his day was about to get even more complicated than it already was. Sarah reached into her back pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. Jake watched with growing confusion as she opened it and held it out for him to see. Inside was a military identification card with her photograph and official credentials. Jake squinted at the ID card, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The name read Admiral Sarah Mitchell, and beside it were the unmistakable insignia of a 2-star admiral in the United States Navy. His eyes moved between the photograph and the woman standing in front of him, and slowly, the terrible reality began to sink in. "No," he whispered, his face draining of all color. "No, no, no. This can't be happening." Jake's legs felt weak and he had to put his hand against the wall to steady himself. In the span of a few seconds, his world had shifted from bad to absolutely catastrophic. He hadn't just assaulted a civilian. He had physically attacked one of the highest-ranking officers on the entire base. "Oh, God," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'm dead. I'm completely dead. They're going to throw me in military prison and throw away the key." Sarah watched as Jake processed the magnitude of his mistake. She had seen this reaction before when junior personnel realized they had crossed a line with a superior officer, but she had never been on this side of such an extreme situation. "Jake, look at me," she said firmly. "Breathe. You're not dead and you're not going to prison." But Jake was spiraling into panic. "Admiral, I am so sorry. I had no idea. I thought you were just a civilian and I was having the worst day and I just snapped. Please, I know I don't deserve any mercy, but I swear on my mother's grave that I'm not the kind of person who hurts women. I've never done anything like this before in my life." "Jake," Sarah repeated more firmly this time, "I need you to stop panicking and listen to me carefully." Jake forced himself to focus on her voice, though his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The corridor seemed to be spinning around him, and he felt like he might be sick. "Yes, ma'am," he managed to say, automatically switching to the formal address required when speaking to such a high-ranking officer. "First, I want you to understand that I'm not angry with you," Sarah said slowly. "Disappointed in your behavior, yes. Concerned about what led to this situation, absolutely, but not angry." Jake stared at her in disbelief. "How can you not be angry? I grabbed you. I pushed you against a wall. I threatened you. If someone did that to my sister, I'd want to kill them." Sarah could see that Jake was genuinely horrified by his own actions, which told her more about his character than anything else that had happened. Soldiers who were truly dangerous or malicious rarely showed this level of remorse when confronted with their behavior. "Because I understand that you weren't attacking Admiral Mitchell," she explained. "You were lashing out at a world that felt like it was crushing you. The fact that I happened to be wearing civilian clothes doesn't excuse your actions, but it does help me understand the context." Jake shook his head, unable to accept her reasoning. "That doesn't matter, ma'am. I should have recognized your authority regardless of what you were wearing. I should have been respectful to any person on this base, civilian or military. There's no excuse for what I did." Sarah felt a surge of respect for Jake's response. Even in his panic, he was taking full responsibility for his actions, rather than making excuses or trying to minimize what had happened. This was the mark of someone who could potentially grow from this experience. "You're absolutely right," she agreed. "There is no excuse for what you did. But there might be an explanation, and there's definitely an opportunity for you to learn from this and become a better soldier because of it." "I don't understand," Jake said, still struggling to keep up with the conversation. "Shouldn't you be calling the military police right now?" Sarah moved to the storage room door that had started this entire encounter and began checking the lock mechanism. "Help me with this door," she said, ignoring his question for the moment. Jake hesitated, confused by the sudden shift in topic, but his training kicked in and he moved to assist her. Together they secured the door properly, and Sarah made a note on her phone about the security violation. "Jake, I'm going to ask you a question and I want you to answer honestly," she said as they finished with the door. "If our positions were reversed, if you were the Admiral and I was the private who had just assaulted you, what would you do?" Jake thought carefully about her question, understanding that his answer might determine his fate. "I'd want to understand why it happened," he said finally, "and I'd want to make sure it never happened again. But I'd also have to follow protocol and report it, because other soldiers need to know that kind of behavior has consequences." Sarah nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right answer. And it tells me that underneath all the personal problems and frustration, you still understand what it means to be a leader and a soldier." "But I'm not a leader," Jake protested. "I'm just a private who can't even manage his own life, let alone lead other people." "Every soldier is a leader in some capacity," Sarah replied. "You represent the military to your family, your friends, and everyone in your community. Other young people look at soldiers like you and decide whether they want to serve their country. How you conduct yourself matters more than you realize." Jake had never thought about his role in the military that way before. He had always seen himself as just another cog in a massive machine. But Admiral Mitchell was suggesting that he had actual influence and responsibility beyond just following orders. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice steadier than it had been since he learned her identity. Sarah looked at her watch and then back at Jake. Now, you're going to walk with me to Building A, and we're going to have a conversation with Colonel Peterson about your future in the military. Jake felt his panic return. Colonel Peterson was the base commander, and a meeting with him could only mean one thing: the end of his military career. "Admiral, please," Jake said desperately. "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything, but could you give me a chance to resign quietly? I don't want this to follow me for the rest of my life. I'll leave the military and never cause any more problems for anyone." Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him fully. "Jake, do you think running away from your problems is going to solve anything?" "It's not running away," Jake insisted. "It's taking responsibility. I messed up, and the honorable thing to do is remove myself from the situation before I cause any more damage." "The honorable thing to do," Sarah said firmly, "is to face the consequences of your actions and work to become better. If you resign now, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what might have happened if you had been brave enough to fight for your second chance." As they walked across the base toward Building A, Jake felt like he was marching toward his own execution. Other soldiers they passed snapped to attention when they recognized Admiral Mitchell, and Jake could see the confusion in their eyes as they tried to figure out why a private was walking casually beside such a high-ranking officer. "They're all staring," Jake muttered, his anxiety building with each step. "They're showing proper respect for rank," Sarah corrected. "Something you might want to remember for future encounters." Jake winced at the reminder of his earlier behavior. "Admiral, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead. Why were you dressed like a civilian? I mean, I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but I'm trying to understand how I missed all the signs that you were military." Sarah considered his question as they approached the main administrative building. "I was conducting an informal inspection to see how personnel behave when they think no senior officers are around. It's something I do periodically to get an honest picture of base operations." "And what did you learn from tonight's inspection?" Jake asked, dreading the answer. "I learned that we have a young soldier who's struggling with personal problems and needs better support from his leadership," Sarah replied. "I also learned that our security protocols need reinforcement, and that sometimes the most important conversations happen in the most unexpected circumstances." Jake looked at her with surprise. "You're not going to say that you learned soldiers assault civilians when no one's watching?" "Is that what happened?" Sarah asked pointedly. "Did you attack me because you thought there would be no consequences? Or did you lash out because you were in pain and I was in the wrong place at the wrong time?" Jake thought about her question seriously. "The second one," he admitted. "If I had known you were an admiral, I never would have touched you. But honestly, if you had been anyone else, another soldier, a contractor, even a general, I probably would have done the same thing. I was just so angry about everything in my life." "That's a problem we need to address," Sarah said as they entered Building A. "Your rank and position give you no right to intimidate or assault anyone, regardless of their status. A good soldier protects people who can't protect themselves, not the other way around." The administrative building was quieter than the rest of the base, with only a few personnel working late shifts. Sarah led Jake through familiar corridors toward the base commander's office, her heels clicking against the polished floors. "Admiral Mitchell," Jake said suddenly, stopping in the middle of the hallway. "Before we go in there, I need to say something." Sarah turned to face him, noting the serious expression on his face. "I want to thank you," he continued. "Not for what's about to happen, because I know I deserve whatever punishment is coming, but for the way you handled everything back there. You could have had me arrested immediately, but instead you took the time to listen and understand what was going wrong in my life. No one's done that for me in a long time." Sarah felt her respect for Jake grow even more. Despite his earlier mistakes, he was showing maturity and grace under pressure that many soldiers twice his age couldn't manage. "Jake, I want you to remember something," she said. "Good leaders don't just give orders and punish mistakes. They invest in their people and help them become the best versions of themselves. What happened tonight was unacceptable, but it doesn't define who you are unless you let it." They reached Colonel Peterson's office, where Sarah knocked on the door. A voice from inside called for them to enter, and Sarah opened the door to reveal Colonel Peterson working at his desk under the soft glow of a desk lamp. Colonel Peterson looked up from his paperwork and immediately stood when he saw Admiral Mitchell. He was a tall, stern-looking man in his 50s with graying hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "Admiral Mitchell," he said with surprise. "I wasn't expecting to see you this evening. How can I help you?" Good evening, Colonel, Sarah replied formally. I need to speak with you about Private Morrison here. We've had an incident that requires your attention. Colonel Peterson's eyes shifted to Jake, and Jake could see the colonel trying to assess the situation. Jake stood at rigid attention, his uniform suddenly feeling too tight and his mouth completely dry. What kind of incident? Colonel Peterson asked, his voice taking on the serious tone that every soldier dreaded. Sarah gestured toward the chairs in front of the colonel's desk. Perhaps we should sit down. This is going to require a detailed explanation. As they took their seats, Jake felt like his heart might explode from anxiety. This was it. The moment when his military career would officially end and his future would be decided by people he had disappointed. Private Morrison, Colonel Peterson said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. Would you like to explain what brings you to my office with Admiral Mitchell at this time of evening? Jake glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. He took a deep breath and forced himself to meet the colonel's eyes. Sir, approximately 30 minutes ago, I physically assaulted Admiral Mitchell in the corridor near Building C. I pushed her against a wall and held her there while making threatening statements. I had no knowledge of her rank or identity at the time, but that doesn't excuse my actions in any way. Colonel Peterson's expression grew increasingly grim as Jake spoke. When Jake finished, the office fell into complete silence except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. You physically assaulted Admiral Mitchell? Colonel Peterson repeated slowly, as if making sure he had heard correctly. Yes, sir, Jake replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Colonel Peterson looked at Sarah with concern. Admiral, are you injured? Do you need medical attention? I'm fine, Colonel, Sarah assured him. Private Morrison released me as soon as I asked him to, and he's been completely cooperative since then. That's something, I suppose, Colonel Peterson said grimly. Private Morrison, do you understand the severity of what you've just confessed to? You've admitted to assaulting a flag officer. Under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, that's grounds for court-martial and significant prison time. Jake felt the room spin around him, but he forced himself to remain upright. Yes, sir, I understand. However, Sarah interjected, before you make any decisions about Private Morrison's future, I'd like you to hear the full story of what happened tonight and my recommendations for how this situation should be handled. Colonel Peterson leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I'm listening, Admiral, but I have to tell you, this is going to be difficult to overlook regardless of the circumstances. Sarah spent the next 20 minutes giving Colonel Peterson a detailed account of everything that had happened, from the initial collision to Jake's emotional breakdown about his personal life, to his genuine remorse once he understood the gravity of his actions. She spoke carefully and objectively, neither minimizing Jake's behavior nor painting him as irredeemable. Colonel, I've been in the military for 16 years, Sarah concluded. I've seen soldiers who are genuinely dangerous, and I've seen good people who make terrible mistakes under extreme stress. Private Morrison falls into the second category. Colonel Peterson had listened without interruption, occasionally glancing at Jake to gauge his reactions. Jake had remained perfectly still throughout the entire recounting, his face growing paler with each detail. Private Morrison, Colonel Peterson said when Sarah finished. Admiral Mitchell has given me her perspective on tonight's events. Now I want to hear yours. Do you agree with her account? Yes, sir, Jake replied immediately. Everything she said is accurate. If anything, she was more generous in her description than I deserve. Tell me about this letter from your girlfriend, Colonel Peterson continued. How long have you been dealing with personal problems that might affect your performance? Jake took a shaky breath. Sir, I received the letter this morning. My girlfriend of 3 years informed me that she's been having an affair with my best friend from back home. They're planning to move in together. But honestly, my performance problems started before this. I've been struggling for about 6 months. Struggling how? Failed inspections, poor performance reviews, difficulty focusing during training exercises. My sergeant has been documenting my problems, and I know I've been a disappointment to my unit. Colonel Peterson pulled out a file from his desk drawer and opened it. Jake recognized it as his personnel file, and his stomach sank even further. According to your records, you had excellent marks during basic training and your first year of service, Colonel Peterson observed. What changed? I made some mistakes during a major training exercise last spring, Jake explained. After that, it felt like I couldn't do anything right. The more I failed, the more I started believing I wasn't cut out for military service, It became a cycle where I expected to fail, so I did. Colonel Peterson nodded thoughtfully. And instead of seeking help or counseling, you internalized the problem and let it affect every aspect of your service. Yes, sir. I was too proud to admit I was struggling, and I didn't want to seem weak in front of my fellow soldiers. Sarah watched the exchange carefully, noting how Jake continued to take full responsibility for his actions without making excuses. This level of accountability, even under extreme stress, was exactly what she had hoped to see. Private Morrison, Colonel Peterson said, closing the file. Under normal circumstances, what you did tonight would result in immediate court-martial proceedings and the end of your military career. The fact that you assaulted a flag officer makes this an extremely serious offense. Jake nodded, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. I understand, sir. However, Colonel Peterson continued, Admiral Mitchell has made some compelling arguments about your character and potential for rehabilitation. She's also made some specific recommendations about how this situation should be handled. Jake looked at Sarah with surprise. She had been advocating for him during their conversation, even after everything he had put her through. Admiral Mitchell believes that destroying your career over this incident would be a waste of a soldier who could potentially contribute significantly to the military if given proper support and guidance, Colonel Peterson explained. She's proposed an alternative to court-martial proceedings. What kind of alternative? Jake asked, hardly daring to hope. Sarah leaned forward in her chair. Private Morrison, what I'm about to propose is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. It's an opportunity to prove that tonight was an aberration and not a reflection of who you really are, but it will require more commitment and effort than you've ever put into anything in your life. I'll do whatever you ask, Jake said immediately. Anything. First, you'll be transferred to a new unit under the direct supervision of Master Sergeant Rodriguez, Sarah began. She specializes in working with soldiers who are struggling with personal and professional challenges. You'll report to her every day for the next 6 months. Jake nodded eagerly, though he had no idea who Master Sergeant Rodriguez was or what her supervision would entail. Second, you'll attend mandatory counseling sessions twice a week to address the emotional issues that led to tonight's incident. This isn't punishment. It's professional development to help you manage stress and personal problems without letting them affect your service. Yes, ma'am. Third, you'll be placed on probation for 1 year. Any violation of military regulations, any hint of aggressive behavior, any failure to meet the standards expected of a soldier, and you'll face immediate court-martial for tonight's incident, plus whatever new charges apply. The weight of Sarah's proposal was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just a second chance. It was a complete restructuring of his military service with constant oversight and evaluation. Finally, Sarah continued, you'll spend 4 hours every Saturday for the next year working with at-risk youth in the local community. You'll help them understand the opportunities that military service can provide, and maybe in the process, you'll remember why you enlisted in the first place. Colonel Peterson studied Jake's face as Sarah outlined the terms. Private Morrison, this is an extraordinarily generous offer from Admiral Mitchell. I want you to understand that accepting it means you'll be under more scrutiny than any other soldier on this base. Your every action will be evaluated, and there will be no tolerance for any behavior that reflects poorly on the military. Jake felt tears welling up in his eyes, though he fought to keep them from falling. Sir, Admiral Mitchell, I don't know how to thank you for this opportunity. I know I don't deserve it, but I swear I won't let you down. Don't thank us yet, Colonel Peterson warned. Prove to us that our faith in you is justified. Master Sergeant Rodriguez has rehabilitated soldiers who were written off by everyone else, but she's also recommended the discharge of soldiers who couldn't or wouldn't change. Your success will depend entirely on your own commitment to becoming better. Sarah stood up from her chair, and both men immediately followed suit. Private Morrison, there's one more thing I need from you before we finalize this arrangement. Anything, ma'am. I want you to write a letter to yourself, she said. A letter explaining what happened tonight, why it happened, and what you're going to do to make sure it never happens again. You'll give that letter to Master Sergeant Rodriguez and she'll keep it in your file. If you ever find yourself struggling again, she'll give it back to you to remind you of this moment and the commitment you're making tonight. Jake nodded, understanding the significance of what she was asking. The letter would serve as both a confession and a promise to his future self. Colonel Peterson, Sarah said, turning to the base commander, I'll need you to prepare the paperwork for Private Morrison's transfer and probationary status. I'll handle the arrangements with Master Sergeant Rodriguez and the counseling services. Of course, Admiral. I'll have everything ready by tomorrow morning. As they prepared to leave the office, Jake felt a strange mixture of relief, gratitude, and determination. His military career wasn't over. In fact, it was about to begin again in a completely different way. 6 months later, Jake Morrison stood in formation with his new unit, listening to Master Sergeant Rodriguez conduct the morning briefing. The transformation in his appearance and demeanor was remarkable. His uniform was impeccable, his posture confident, and his eyes held a focus and determination that had been missing for over a year. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was a compact woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and eyes that seemed to see through any pretense or excuse. She had taken Jake under her wing from his first day in the new unit. But her support came with expectations that were higher than anything he had previously experienced. "Morrison," she called out as the formation was dismissed. "A word." Jake approached his supervisor with the respectful attention he had learned to maintain over the past months. "Yes, Master Sergeant. Your performance evaluation came back from headquarters," she said, holding up an official document. "Care to guess what it says?" Jake felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, though it was much more manageable than the panic attacks he used to experience. The counseling sessions had taught him techniques for managing stress and negative emotions before they overwhelmed his judgment. "I hope it's positive, Master Sergeant, but I'm prepared to work harder if there are areas that need improvement." Rodriguez smiled slightly. The first time Jake had seen her show approval so openly. "Exceptional performance in all categories. Recommended for accelerated promotion track. Commendation for leadership potential and dedication to duty." Jake stared at her in disbelief. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious, Morrison. You've become everything I hoped you could be when Admiral Mitchell first brought you to me. The question is, how do you feel about that?" Jake thought about her question carefully, a habit he had developed through months of counseling and reflection. "I feel grateful, Master Sergeant, and I feel like I understand what it means to be a soldier in a way I never did before." "Explain that." "Before, I thought being a soldier was about following orders and staying out of trouble. Now I understand it's about serving something bigger than yourself and taking responsibility for making everyone around you better. It's about leadership even when you're not in charge." Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "That's exactly right. And speaking of leadership, I have something to tell you. Admiral Mitchell has requested a meeting with you this afternoon." Jake felt his pulse quicken, though not with the panic he would have experienced months earlier. He hadn't spoken to Admiral Mitchell since that night in Colonel Peterson's office, though he knew she had been monitoring his progress through official reports. "Did she say what it was about?" "She's got a proposition for you. Something about your future in the military that goes beyond your current assignment." That afternoon, Jake found himself back in the administrative building where his new life had begun. Admiral Mitchell's temporary office was located on the 3rd floor, and as he knocked on her door, he reflected on how different he felt from the angry, desperate young man who had made such a terrible mistake 6 months ago. "Come in," Admiral Mitchell called from inside. Jake entered the office and stood at attention, waiting for permission to speak. Admiral Mitchell looked up from her computer and smiled warmly when she saw him. "At ease, Morrison. Please have a seat." Jake sat down in the chair across from her desk, noting how different this interaction felt from their last formal meeting. There was no tension, no fear, just mutual respect between two military professionals. "I've been following your progress with Master Sergeant Rodriguez," Admiral Mitchell began. "I have to say I'm impressed with the transformation you've made." "Thank you, ma'am. I owe everything to the opportunity you gave me that night. I know I didn't deserve it. You've more than earned it through your efforts over the past 6 months," she replied. "But I didn't ask you here just to congratulate you on your progress. I have an offer that might interest you." Jake leaned forward slightly, curious about what she might propose. "How would you feel about attending officer candidate school?" she asked directly. Jake's mouth fell open in shock. "OCS? Ma'am, I'm just a private who barely kept his career 6 months ago. I'm not officer material." "6 months ago, you weren't," Admiral Mitchell agreed. "But the soldier sitting in front of me today absolutely is. You've demonstrated leadership, accountability, and the ability to grow from your mistakes. Those are exactly the qualities we need in our officers." Jake struggled to process what she was telling him. "But my record, the incident, Surely that would disqualify me from ever becoming an officer. Your record shows a soldier who faced his lowest moment with honesty and used it as motivation to become better, Admiral Mitchell explained. The military needs officers who understand failure and redemption, not just those who've never been tested. I don't know what to say, Jake admitted. This is beyond anything I ever imagined possible. Say you'll think about it seriously, Admiral Mitchell suggested. Talk to Master Sergeant Rodriguez. Talk to your counselor. Talk to the young people you've been mentoring on Saturdays. Get their perspectives on whether you're ready for this kind of responsibility. Jake nodded, still stunned by the possibility. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Of course. Now, why are you doing this for me? I mean, I understand giving me a second chance, but recommending me for OCS seems like you're going above and beyond what anyone could expect. Admiral Mitchell was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. Jake, in my 16 years in the military, I've learned that our greatest strength isn't our weapons or our technology. It's our people. And sometimes our best people are the ones who've had to fight their way back from rock bottom. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the base where soldiers were going about their daily routines. That night 6 months ago, I saw a young man who was drowning in his own problems, but still had the core values that make a good soldier. More importantly, I saw someone who was willing to take responsibility for his mistakes and work to become better. Those qualities are rare, and they're exactly what we need in our leaders. Jake felt a profound sense of gratitude and responsibility settling over him. If I do this, if I go to OCS, I want you to know that I'll never forget where I came from or the chance you gave me. I'm counting on that, Admiral Mitchell replied, turning back to face him. The military needs officers who remember what it's like to struggle, who can relate to soldiers facing their own challenges, and who understand that leadership is about lifting people up, not just giving orders. As Jake prepared to leave her office, he realized that his journey from that terrible night 6 months ago had led him to a place he never could have imagined. The young man who had assaulted an admiral in a moment of desperate anger was gone, replaced by someone who was being offered the chance to lead other soldiers. Admiral, he said as he reached the door, I have one more question. Go ahead. Do you ever regret not having me arrested that night? Do you ever wonder if you made the wrong choice? Admiral Mitchell smiled. Jake, the measure of a leader isn't whether they make perfect decisions, but whether they make decisions that help people become the best versions of themselves. Looking at you now, I know I made exactly the right choice. As Jake walked back across the base, he thought about the letter he had written to himself that first night, the letter that Master Sergeant Rodriguez still kept in his file. He realized that he had kept every promise he had made to himself in that letter, and now he was being offered the chance to make new promises about the leader he wanted to become. The young man who had once felt like he had no future now stood on the brink of possibilities he had never dared to imagine. His story had begun with his worst moment, but it was far from over.